Hi there, Coach Alexa here. I want to talk about the menopause today. It is a massive topic and I am only going to talk about it from a point of view of running and training for running. It's such a huge part or stage for a woman to go through in her life and has such big ramifications and changes on her physical and mental health. So yeah, not a topic I'm going to cover in a brief YouTube video as a whole, but if you're a runner and you're interested in those aspects of the menopause that are going to impact your training, then this is the place to be. So just a quick kind of check-in on terminology to start with. So I guess there's the pre-menopause phase where you're having a regular monthly cycle. Then there's, on average, a 4-year phase where everything starts getting a little bit off kilter. That cycle maybe becomes more irregular. There might be longer and then shorter, a mix of gaps between periods. Your estrogen levels are dropping throughout all of this. And by the end, you get to the point where you are not having periods anymore. So when you've reached that point, you say you've not had a period for about a year or so, a good few months, and that is the point where you've come out the other side of menopause. You're a post-menopausal woman. And actually, from what I've heard from the runners that I work with that have gone through to this stage, things are just a lot nicer and a lot more predictable then, because your hormones are pretty static from that point on. So you've not got the turmoil of the menopause and you've not got the monthly cycle that you had before. That, on average, 4-year period in the middle happens around the age of 45 in most women. And that's probably the most challenging time in terms of the impact on our bodies and our brains, and some fairly fundamental changes that we go through in terms of the way our bodies work. It's all linked to the fact that estrogen, which is our kind of key hormone that is driven around our ovulation cycle, drops. So what does that do? First of all, it has a bit of an impact on our tendons and ligaments. So there are a few studies that have shown that there's a potentially higher injury risk because our tendons and ligaments are impacted by that drop off in estrogen levels. It can also impact the core and pelvic floor areas because there's lots of tendons and ligaments kind of holding all of our core and pelvic floor together. It can also potentially impact the healing time that there might be for tendon and ligament related injuries. So if you've had tendinitis, tendinosis, then those may take a little bit longer to heal as you're going through the menopause and also after you're out the other side. We also go through muscular changes. So estrogen as well as testosterone are hormones that help us maintain and develop muscle mass. Testosterone in women, like in men, gradually drops off throughout our life, but we have a much more kind of marked drop in estrogen as we go through the menopause. So you may well lose, on average, 20% of our muscle mass as we've gone through that stage over a period of a few years, which is quite a lot. So a couple of different impacts that this has. Muscle, obviously, is great for running, great for training, great for power and speed. It also sits there and burns calories nicely without even you having to lift a finger. So that kind of links into some of the other hormonal changes and body fat percentage changes that might occur as well as we go through the menopause. The nice thing about the muscular changes is that it's a pretty simple thing that we can do to help stop or reverse those changes, and that is strength training. I know I bang on about this a lot, but it's so important. With good strength training, particularly when we're working that resistance, adding a bit of weight, kind of putting back on that muscle mass or maintaining that muscle mass as we go through the menopause, that is going to have a fantastic outcome for us. We're not going to drop off as much in speed. And also doing some higher intensity exercises, so skips, jumps, hill repeats, some plyometric stuff really helps maintain the explosive power and our ability to deploy that explosive power from our high twitch muscle fibres. So have a little bit of think if you're not already including strength training in your plan for any age of your life, but particularly if you are approaching or going through the menopause. That is all important even for endurance runners. So a lot of endurance runners think they don't have to do strength training. Oh, you absolutely do, and it has even more of a benefit at that point in a woman's life. This old favourite now, oestrogen, has an important role in bone health as well. So I think most women are aware of the fact that when they go through the menopause, their bone density will start to drop. About 20% of their bone density within 5 to 7 years of going through the menopause would have dropped off. So osteopenia is the stage before osteoporosis. Osteoporosis where your bones are probably quite dangerously weak and not as strong as they were. Running is a high impact sport. High impact sports are brilliant for bone density because they basically challenge the bones every time we land on the floor. The bones have to adapt, they're stimulated to adapt and grow stronger. So if you're already running, great. If you continue running, even better through the menopause, because you're going to be going into it with stronger bones and you're going to come out the other side with stronger bones because you're not going to have had as much of an impact in that drop off in estrogen. Your bone health is going to remain good. When they've done studies of running versus cycling versus walking through the menopause and the outcomes on bone density, running comes out on top. So definitely something that is good to continue doing. That said, if you're during the menopause or post-menopause when you start running, it is important that you ramp up that little bit more gently because you've probably lost a good proportion of bone density, unfortunately, in that phase. Running, as I said, is a high impact sport, so we don't want to load the bones up too much too soon. We want to take a nice gradual approach to loading when we start running, as I say, during or post-menopause. Strength training also really helps with bone density, so another good reason why that needs to be a key part of your routine. On the subject of food, so again, one of the impacts of pesky estrogen is that we tend to be better at storing fat and not as good at maintaining muscle. So we might notice a little bit of a spread as we go through the menopause and out the other side as those estrogen levels drop. A great way to kind of counter some of the effects of that is to keep active, keep running, do some strength training, maintain that muscle mass. We also, though, change the way we process carbohydrates. So you might be used to, taking on energy gels, sports drinks, that sort of things to fuel longer runs, perhaps if you're training for a half marathon or a marathon or beyond. And be aware that those changing estrogen levels will change the way we process and the way our digestive systems can deal with those carbohydrates. So you might have to change things up a little bit. Generally good advice to try and avoid those processed carbs, the sugars, the white bread, that kind of thing. Move a lot more towards whole grains, more complex carbohydrate, getting carbohydrates from vegetables, from pulses, that kind of thing. Generally a good strategy to move towards as we go through the menopause. In terms of what you're eating as well, post-run snacks that have got some protein in them are also really, really good. We want to do all we can to help our body maintain that muscle mass. So when we've done some training, even a strength session or a run, having some protein intake within an hour to 90 minutes of that session will allow our bodies to be able to do a really, really good job of building those muscles that little bit stronger for us. So bearing that in mind as well. Another thing to think about that people experience as they go through the menopause are hot flushes. So estrogen, again, has a role in our thermal regulation, does all sorts of things. So we will have a little bit more of an interesting time maintaining our temperature levels. The first thing to say is if you're on a run and you happen to have a hot flush, it's not dangerous in any way. It's almost more our perception of our temperature that changes than our actual core body temperature. But that said, it can feel really weird and quite uncomfortable. So have a little think about some physical cooling strategies to try and cool you down and make you feel better if you're going through one of those hot flushes. So a cool bandana or towels that you can put on yourself to try and give that cooling sort of sensation. The other thing to think about is overnight. So hot flushes at night are not great fun. If you usually train later in the evening, so maybe after work, or even if you're training, you've got training after dinner, after work, so your training sessions are even later in the evening, we tend to carry a higher core body temperature level for a few hours after a training session. So bearing that in mind when you go to bed, we sleep better when our core body temperature has been given the chance to drop slightly cooler. So it's not a great combination if you're going into bed already with that slightly elevated core body temperature from a recent training session, and then you get a hot flush, it's going to be a whole world of sweatiness. So perhaps thinking about adjusting the timing of those training sessions if you're a mid to late evening runner. The other interesting phenomenon that can creep in as well is the impact that the good old estrogen has on our blood pressure. So our blood pressure regulation gets a little bit more kind of here, there and everywhere, and that can lead to a little bit of a higher level of post-run sort of dizziness and general lightheadedness. So it can happen quite a lot. Anyway, in runners, I have quite low blood pressure. If I've done a really, really hard session and I stop quite quickly, I don't do a really nice gradual ramped cool down, I'll often get those moments where it's all gone a bit wonky and dizzy. So keeping hydrated is key. Keep your blood pressure up. Making sure that you keep yourself nice and cool, and just being aware of the fact that that might happen is and that something odd isn't necessarily going on is a good thing. Why is it good to keep running through the menopause? I think primarily to lift your mood. It's quite a challenging time of life to go through. Our body suddenly becomes very, very unpredictable. Lots of different sort of symptoms that impact us, and keeping up with some running to elevate our mood has got to be a good thing. It also can work towards offsetting, I guess, some of the metabolic changes we go through, so offsetting that tendency to store a little bit more body fat as we go through the menopause. It can also massively offset those changes in bone density that a lot of people have. So keeping up with running as a nice high impact sport, maintaining those stronger bones, really great for bone health and for stress fractures, and means that later on in life, if you happen to fall over on some ice, the likelihood of you breaking something is a lot less, which has got to be good. And strength training, keep saying it, is going to be so helpful for you. It's brilliantly helpful for your running anyway, challenging yourself on the weight and the resistance, really taking that strength training seriously, doing it at least 2, if not 3 times a week. But it's going to have even more of an impact on our bone density, on our fitness, and particularly on the amount of muscle mass we can maintain as we go through the menopause. So keep bearing all of those positives in mind. A few other little key tips, particularly with regards to training. It is quite a changeable period in our lives, and I find it's really useful anyway, but particularly at this kind of time in women's lives, to maintain a training diary. So keep a little bit of a log, not just about distance, time and pace, but about how you felt the run went. How did the fueling, your usual fueling, work? Or is that something that we might need to start tweaking? What were your energy levels? How did you sleep? When was your last period? How long has it been since that? What might your hormones be up to? I think the more knowledge that we can accumulate and write down and have an awareness of, the better at any point, but particularly at this slightly more complicated time in our lives. Get support. So Facebook groups, online communities, getting in touch with other women that are going through that same period of their lives or have gone out the other side or a little wiser for it. With anything sort of health related, creating that community of people who understand and that you can have a bit of a chat to is really powerful. Usually in non-COVID era, my GP surgery would have a group, of people that just met up like a drop-in once a month that you could join, which is super helpful. And do remember that the sort of more challenging period of the menopause is time limited. So the average is around 4 years. So after you get out of that, yes, you will have that lower estrogen level, and some of these things around muscle mass and bone density will still be there for the rest of your lives. But that really changeable period where the hormones are going all over the place or, disappearing for a bit and then coming back unexpectedly and all of this sort of stuff will have stopped. So it's one of the few times in our life and before we started our periods where actually everything is pretty stable from a hormonal point of view, which is good. It's nice to have kind of a normal sort of balance to our lives and a little bit less fluctuation. So, the end is in sight when you're going through some of these changes. I'm going to follow up with a video hopefully next week, which is going to talk a little bit about resources, how you can look into things in a little bit more detail on your own and learn more about this. I'm a massive fan of knowledge is power in any situation. So, book recommendations, a few sort of athletes to follow. And I'm also going to talk about an analogy that a wonderful lady called Jasmine Muller, who's an ultra cyclist and endurance athlete, has come up with for describing, sort of what goes on in that perimenopause phase from like an athlete point of view, which is super useful. Any questions in the meantime, of course, just let me know.